Picture this. You're a Roman senator strolling through the Subura, that notorious district of pleasure and temptation, when suddenly you catch sight of a familiar figure inside a crowded brothel. At first, you think your eyes must be deceiving you. But then, through the layers of cheap paint and dim candlelight, the face becomes clear. Your heart stops. This isn't just some common woman earning her keep. It's Valeria Messalina, Empress of Rome, wife of Emperor Claudius, the woman who should be ruling at his side, now disguised, mingling with strangers, chasing thrills in the city's underbelly. And this was no case of desperation. She wasn't forced into such surroundings. No, Messalina chose to descend into this world. She would leave the palace at night, competing with brothel workers, determined to prove she could outlast them all in her reckless games. Think you've already heard wild stories about Roman excess? What you're about to discover makes the infamous Caligula seem tame by comparison. For Rome's third empress didn't merely bend the rules of morality. She turned her desires into a weapon that would shake the empire and, in the end, bring about her own ruin. It all began in 38 CE, with what looked like a picture-perfect imperial wedding. Valeria Messalina, barely 15, became the bride of Emperor Claudius. The ceremony symbolized everything Rome cherished: noble bloodlines, the promise of heirs, and the blending of ancient patrician families. To the Roman eye, she was flawless, youthful, striking, descended from one of the oldest aristocratic clans. Claudius, 13 years older and living with the challenges of a physical condition we'd now call cerebral palsy, seemed overjoyed at such a match. Writers of the time praised her beauty: fair skin, golden hair, and the refined features of high birth. In her early years, she played her part to perfection, bearing 2 children for Claudius, standing at his side during ceremonies, and projecting the image of the ideal Roman empress. But Roman society was strict. Women were divided into rigid categories. The honorable wife and mother stood at the top, while entertainers and courtesans occupied the lowest rung. For an empress, the expectation was even higher. She was to be the embodiment of virtue itself. Even whispers of misconduct could rattle the stability of the empire. And that's what made Messalina's hidden life so dangerous. Because behind the shining marble of the Palatine Palace, a very different story was unfolding. The same young woman who smiled gracefully at festivals and welcomed ambassadors at grand banquets was secretly plotting nightly escapades, ventures so scandalous that even Rome's most jaded elites would struggle to believe them. Messalina's transformation didn't happen overnight. It began quietly, almost unnoticed, in her very first year as empress. Servants whispered of odd patterns. She would dismiss her guards earlier than usual, claiming she was too tired, only to slip out later dressed in plain clothing that hid her identity. At first, these secret wanderings looked like the harmless rebellion of a teenager trapped in the rigid routines of palace life. But soon, her midnight strolls grew into something far more deliberate, something unsettling. Messalina wasn't simply wandering Rome for freedom. She was studying. She observed the city's working women, memorizing their techniques, their usual corners, even the types of clients they served. It was less an idle curiosity and more like a general mapping out a campaign. The first real incident took place during the Saturnalia festival of 40 CE, that wild holiday when society turned upside down and the usual rules of morality loosened. While Claudius carried out his official duties at the temples, Messalina slipped into the crowded Subura, disguised as a common woman. What might have started as curiosity quickly spiraled into obsession. She wasn't content with watching. She wanted to compete. She needed to prove herself against the very people society placed at the lowest rank. Roman historian Tacitus later wrote about the whispers from palace insiders who pieced together what happened next. Messalina approached a brothel keeper, asking to work for just one night under a false name. Believing her to be an adventurous noblewoman, the proprietor agreed. But what followed left the establishment stunned. Messalina didn't just participate. She outpaced the most seasoned workers. She took on more clients than anyone expected, showing an appetite that astonished even those used to extreme demands. And when dawn finally broke and the others laid down their work, Messalina refused to stop. She demanded more clients, more challenges, more chances to prove that even an empress could surpass every woman in Rome's underworld. Eventually, the brothel keeper had to insist that she leave. But by then, the damage was done. Messalina had discovered a dangerous new obsession, one she would pursue with frightening determination. Within months, her secret adventures had taken on a structured, almost military precision. She built a trusted circle of servants who knew how to sneak her past the palace guards. She secured disguises that transformed her completely, and even crafted false identities that allowed her to vanish into Rome's shadowy nightlife. But for Messalina, slipping into brothels wasn't enough. Her competitive streak demanded more. Soon she was organizing challenges against Rome's most famous courtesans, wagering vast sums of money on her ability to outlast them. These weren't quiet affairs, either. Word spread quickly. Elite Romans flocked to watch their empress in spectacles that blurred the line between scandal and entertainment. The most notorious contest came in the year 41 CE. Messalina faced off against Sylla, the city's most celebrated courtesan, in what was framed as an endurance trial. The rules were simple. From sunset to sunrise, whoever could endure the most clients would walk away with a fortune in gold. The event drew a crowd of Rome's wealthy nobles. Bets were placed, anticipation filled the air, and the emperor's wife stepped into an arena unlike any gladiatorial combat the empire had ever seen. Sylla, with years of experience, approached the contest like a professional athlete. She paced herself carefully, managing her energy, conserving her strength. By dawn, she had taken on 25 clients and declared victory. But Messalina was far from finished. Even as Sylla surrendered, exhausted, the empress pressed on. Ancient writers claim that by the end of that infamous night, Messalina had taken on more than 30 men, stopping only when no more challengers could be found. But this was no triumphant victory. The audience sat in stunned silence. What they had just witnessed wasn't a spectacle of entertainment, but something profoundly unsettling. Because this wasn't a powerless woman forced into hardship. This was the Empress of Rome, the most powerful woman alive, deliberately seeking out humiliation and drawing excitement from it. For Messalina, the contrast between her public image as a dignified empress and her hidden life in the city's underworld seemed to heighten the thrill. The greater the gap, the more intoxicating it became. But the contests were only the beginning. Messalina's reckless experiments were evolving into something far darker, something that would soon shake the very foundations of Roman politics. If you thought her endurance games were shocking, what came next would make them look almost tame. Because Messalina was about to take her secret obsessions and turn them into a permanent operation. By 42 CE, she crossed a line that transformed her from scandalous figure into a genuine threat to the empire itself. According to later historians, Messalina orchestrated one of the boldest criminal enterprises in Roman history. An exclusive brothel, operating under her own protection, supplied not with common workers but with women drawn from the aristocracy, and patronized by Rome's most influential men. And the location, hidden in plain sight, behind the polished marble of a villa near the Campus Martius, disguised as a fashionable private club for the elite, Messalina's secret empire quietly began its work. Messalina wielded her influence as empress with a ruthless kind of creativity. She pressured noble women into joining her secret circle, making it appear voluntary. Yet behind the scenes, refusal could mean financial ruin or the loss of their family's political standing. What looked like choice was, in truth, intimidation cloaked in elegance. Her brilliance, if one can call it that, was in the way she selected her clients. Unlike common courtesans who catered to anyone, Messalina deliberately focused on senators, generals, and wealthy traders. These were men who held knowledge the imperial court coveted. Each meeting was quietly observed by servants hidden nearby, who noted every word spoken, every hint of weakness, and every secret that could later be exploited. In effect, the empress built a trap more cunning than any military stratagem. Through this network, she learned which senators plotted resistance, which commanders entertained thoughts of betrayal, and which merchants cheated Rome's treasury. This private archive of intelligence gave her a frightening level of control over the very men expected to safeguard the empire alongside her husband. Her tactics were carefully staged and psychologically piercing. She would watch her targets at grand banquets or ceremonies, then lure them to private gatherings at her villa. There, one indulgence would lead to another, lavish entertainment, veiled invitations, and encounters arranged with aristocratic women whose identities remained concealed until the moment of compromise. Only then would the truth be revealed, leaving her victims trapped by their own actions. The shock was devastating. Imagine discovering that the person you had been drawn into an encounter with was not a stranger at all, but the Empress herself, or perhaps the wife or daughter of a political ally. That revelation ensured silence. It ensured obedience. Messalina had transformed personal shame into a weapon of political dominance. And yet, what makes her schemes most unsettling is not just the individuals she ensnared, but the way she unraveled the fabric of Roman society itself. Noble women were forced to act against their dignity, leaders were bent away from their principles, and even the bonds of family became instruments of control. Foreign envoys soon noticed strange patterns, Roman decisions suddenly leaning in favor of certain men, with no clear reason why. Even the military was not immune. Appointments went to candidates with little merit, yet somehow all of them carried the Empress's favor. Trade deals that should have strengthened the empire instead seemed to reward merchants with no obvious ties to Rome's leadership. In reality, the empire's decision-making had been quietly hijacked by an empress who acted less like a dignified partner to the emperor and more like the head of a covert empire of her own. Yet even this hidden web of corruption was only the beginning. By 44 CE, Messalina no longer found secrecy thrilling enough. Her hunger for influence and for spectacle pushed her into the open. She began arranging extravagant public gatherings that blurred the line between entertainment and political theater, compelling Rome's elite to take part in displays that stripped away their dignity while strengthening her grip on power. These occasions weren't random celebrations. They were carefully staged performances presented as religious festivals. Messalina declared she was honoring Rome's gods, and under that pretext, senators, noble families, and high-ranking officials were obliged to attend. What started as solemn rituals gradually shifted into something far more compromising, trapping participants in scenarios they had never expected. The Empress was a master of escalation. She would begin with traditional ceremonies, then weave in so-called ancient customs that felt unusual but just plausible enough to pass. Step by step, the atmosphere shifted until the gathering no longer resembled a festival, but rather an orchestrated test of loyalty. By the time her guests realized the extent of the spectacle, they were already too entangled to resist without exposing themselves. At these events, Messalina's ability to manipulate the human mind reached its zenith. She knew that when men and women of high rank were made to compromise themselves in public, they became bound together by a shared silence. To admit the truth would destroy their reputations, so they accepted the fiction that these were religious observances and carried on as if nothing unusual had occurred. Some chroniclers even claim that rivals of the imperial household were deliberately humiliated during these gatherings. Senators who had spoken out against imperial policies suddenly found themselves reduced to objects of mockery before their peers. In that moment, their political influence evaporated, not through exile or execution, but through shame so profound it silenced them forever. And yet, the most unsettling whispers suggest that Messalina's ambitions did not stop there. With time, her spectacles drew in younger members of Rome's elite, further deepening the moral collapse she orchestrated at the very heart of the empire. Palace notes hint at an even darker turn. Messalina began drawing in the adolescent sons and daughters of Rome's noblest families, insisting their presence was vital for the authenticity of her staged rituals. These young heirs, taught from birth to obey imperial command without hesitation, suddenly found themselves trapped in roles they never chose. In this way, the Empress built a system of control so clever that resisting her seemed impossible. For parents to shield their children, they would first have to admit their own involvement. For leaders to accuse her publicly, they would need to reveal their own participation. Every thread of society was woven into her web, leaving no one able to act without self-destruction. The result was near-total immunity. Messalina had become untouchable, protected not by soldiers or walls, but by the fear of exposure. Foreign envoys began noticing the change. Roman statesmen who once spoke with confidence now appeared hesitant, stammering, even submissive. Military commanders, once proud and decisive, seemed distracted and unusually cautious. The ruling class of Rome had been psychologically conquered by a woman who realized that shame could enslave more effectively than legions. Then came 48 CE, and with it, the final scandal that stunned even a society accustomed to imperial excess. While Emperor Claudius was away in Ostia supervising grain shipments, Messalina staged a wedding unlike any Rome had ever seen. Her chosen groom was Gaius Silius, a striking young senator she had pursued for months. This was no secret romance or symbolic gesture. It was a full legal marriage. There were priests, witnesses, contracts, and the traditional ceremonies of Roman law. By standing before the gods and declaring herself the wife of another man, Messalina effectively announced that she was divorced from Claudius, all while still wearing the crown of Empress. The legal implications alone were staggering. Under Roman law, her union with Silius was binding, even though she remained the emperor's spouse. The celebration itself stretched across several days, spilling into a spectacle that drew in much of what remained of Rome's untainted aristocracy. It was here, in the open air of defiance, that even her most compromised supporters realized the truth. Messalina had moved beyond private excess or ritual theater. Messalina's new marriage wasn't just a scandal. It was a direct strike against the emperor's authority and the stability of Rome itself. By this point, her state of mind seems to have drifted far from reality. She began calling Silius the emperor and naming herself his rightful empress, as if her willpower alone could replace Claudius. Backed by the silence of her compromised victims, she even issued commands in Silius's name and drew up plans for a coronation that would legitimize their rule. What began as flattery for the young senator soon turned into a nightmare. Drawn into her vision of remaking Rome, he realized too late that he was nothing more than a piece in her dangerous game. Historians suggest that Silius started secretly planning escape routes, sensing the disaster closing in. Meanwhile, Emperor Claudius remained completely unaware of the supposed marriage, until a handful of loyal freedmen risked everything to warn him. At first, Claudius refused to believe it. Even for Messalina, such audacity seemed unthinkable. But then came the proof. Witnesses, legal documents, and reports too numerous to ignore. The emperor understood he wasn't facing just personal betrayal, but the very real possibility of civil war. The response was swift. Claudius marched back to Rome with loyal soldiers and confronted Messalina in the gardens where she still reveled in her wedding. Ancient writers describe her last moments as a mix of desperate defiance and dawning terror, as she realized her empire of secrets had finally met something stronger than shame, the raw instinct of imperial survival. Her execution followed quickly, but her downfall didn't end there. Claudius ordered her name chiseled off public monuments, her statues destroyed, and her memory blotted out by the decree of damnatio memoriae, a state-sponsored forgetting so absolute that speaking her name became an act of treason. Thus ended the career of the Empress who had sought to control Rome through intimacy and fear, only to be erased by the same system she once manipulated. Her death closed a chapter when scandal nearly replaced governance as the true force guiding the empire.